So, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, John Protevi. He is the Phyllis M. Taylor Professor of French Studies and a Professor of Philosophy at Louisiana State University. He's the author of many books, including Life War, most recently, Life, War, Earth, Deleuze and the Sciences from Minnesota, 2013. Political Affect, Connecting the Social and the Somatic, also from Minnesota, 2009. Deleuze and Geophilosophy, A Guiding Glossary, which he wrote and edited with Mark Bonta in 2004. Political Physics, you'd rightfully say the book that made you famous. Political Physics, Deleuze, Derrida, and the Body Politic from Althone in 2001. And Time and Exteriority, Aristotle, Heidegger, Derrida from Bucknell in 1994. He's also
the one that fell stillborn from the press.
He's also the editor or co-editor of many collections of essays, as well as the Edinburgh Encyclopedia of Continental Philosophy. I'll also mention that John is now very well known as a founding member and continual contributor to the New Apps blog, which is a really exciting digital forum that brings together continental philosophers, philosophers of science, historians of philosophy, and punk rock.
Yeah. Oh, and straight up Anglo-American analytic philosophy of language. We got some of that too.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic online forum. I think he's one of the leading voices in contemporary continental philosophy, particularly in the study of French figures like Deleuze and Derrida, but many other folks as well. He's someone who's made it possible to bring together discourses that many folks before John's work thought were utterly incommensurable, that one couldn't talk about at the same time. So please welcome me, join me in welcoming him. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you all for coming out on a cold, I guess it's winter, almost winter's afternoon, and thanks to Ryan for a very nice dissertation and for providing the proximate cause of me coming here. So yeah, I am going to talk a little bit about human nature and anthropology in addition to philosophy. So we've had a long discourse of human nature in philosophy, but I think there's some interesting work being done in anthropology right now. So, and disasters help us to get to reveal some, at least hidden cultural presuppositions about human nature. So, we'll talk about disasters first, and then this notion of prosociality and its evolution. We're going to define that in a little bit. Then we'll talk about a big question in contemporary anthropology about whether there was such a thing as war prior to the state, and if there was, how prevalent was it? And if there wasn't, how do we talk about the violence, which was part of a non-state forger society? Because no one denies that there wasn't violence back then. The question is whether it took the form, a form which was recognizable as war. And then we'll ask the Spinoza question, which is, why did men fight for their servitude as fiercely as if it were for their liberation, or something along those lines. Okay, so some definitions. As you know, for a long time we've had a content-filled attempts to define human nature. It's rationality, it's this or it's that. And that's been used as a standard by which to judge fallings off from that. And in, I think, reaction to that, we have a long period in the 20th century of social constructivism. Right? Yes, of course, we're all biological, but basically. And as you know, there's been a lot of debate. Then one of the reactions to the social construction started off being called sociobiology, now its successor, evolutionary psychology, and the question is whether they're being fair or not in calling social constructivism a blank slate business. I don't think it's either, but I do think that we have some ways to talk about human nature in terms of evolution. But I don't think there's much, there's some content to it, but not a lot. Less content than the content-filled human nature people think. but I think that we end up converging on prosociality. We're going to define prosociality as behavior that reinforces social patterns. It's not a normative claim, right? Whatever the content of the social patterns could be, you could be outraged and work to reinforce slavery and racism and misogyny and whatever, right? But there is the tendency, the definition of prosociality I want to get to is the emotional investment in and the action to reinforce social structures. And I think that is, at least my claim, is a sort of default setting for human nature. There is a falling away from that, but that's psychopathy. People are not really invested in the social patterns. They can learn the social patterns sort of cognitively and interact with them and pretend that they're emotionally invested if it's to their benefit. So we're going to talk some more about those kind of things. But we always have to remember prosociality doesn't mean niceness, because it also means punishment for breaking these social patterns. And again, the moral or the normative judgment of the content of those patterns is different than this notion that people are invested in it. That's what motivates the Spinoza question. Right? Why do we get people who are emotionally invested in and willing to fight for these things that seemingly are obviously normatively messed up? So that's the question there. So altruistic punishment, that leads us to this next question. There's three notions of altruism I'm going to talk about. The evolutionary notion is simply fitness costing helping behavior. So helping of one organism by another, that includes a cost in the fitness of the first one. The fitness being the number of offspring, fertile offspring surviving to reproductive age, right? Something along those lines. And that can be recompensed, right? So we're going to talk a lot about the ways in which kin selection and some other ways of accounting for altruistic behavior, even though it should have been weeded out evolutionarily. Because if it has a fitness cost, right, those are the things that get weeded out. But it didn't, so we have to account for that. The psychological notion of altruism, we could say, is something that's done with the intent to help someone else. And depending on your moral framework, some of it is it's only altruistic if it's done without either the expectation, conscious expectation, and you get all sorts of, as we know, all sorts of problems with that. Are you just fooling yourself when you're saying that I'm doing this purely for the sake of the other person? Isn't that itself enough of a psychological recompense, right? Because you're the type of person who selflessly helps somebody else. So we know that Kant says that it's really hard to tell, to plumb the depths of inclination, to tell when something is done purely from duty. It's psychologically very difficult, if not impossible. So those are some terms we need on the board, and then this notion of these terms fly back and forth, but I'm going to define sympathy as, well, both of them can be motivations for altruistic behavior. But I'm going to reserve sympathy for the sharing of emotional states, so feeling along with, and empathy as being concerned for and acting on the behalf of someone or something else, right? Without necessarily sharing the emotional state that the intended, the person that you're trying to help is in. The problem with sympathy as a motivation is that it can fall into a sort of distress relief, that you're trying to help the person because you're sharing their pain and you don't want to feel bad anymore, right? So that's why I'm helping you. On the other hand, full empathy can problematically be paternalistic, cold, some a little too cognitive and involved with it. So these are floating terms. There's a couple of nice books that have come out lately. A guy at Holy Cross, Stoidner, has a book on the philosophical rediscovery of empathy. That's about 2006, so that's one of the things that's got. Okay, so these are my clips. So in response to the Haitian earthquake, we had 2 clips. And so what we're going to see is the reaction to disaster as the revelation of human nature, but we're going to see 2 vastly different notions of human nature revealed through these different political presuppositions. Okay, so we could spend the whole time deconstructing frame by frame. If you saw most of the video, in the background are a bunch of black guys talking on the street. Some guy waved his arms at one point, I think. So there's a lot of very interesting stuff. I don't have any problem whatsoever with the military guy, right? It's the old joke about the carpenter, right? If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. He's a security expert. He sees things in terms of security risks. That's his job. He comes from Somalia or Iraq or whatever. Cavuto, on the other hand, we could talk some more, but he is kind of the one line I like, I love about it is, it's apples and oranges, completely different situation, but Somalia! You'd think I was making that stuff up. All right, next guy. So this is Anderson Cooper, as we know, and this is Senator Russell Honore, who was a military guy, but whose military experience includes being in charge of the Katrina rescue effort. So he's not just a security guy, but he's a security guy in the context of disaster relief. And it's a different story. He has a very different view of what happens at the breakdown of the state. Here, I think the most important line that Honore gives is that the people of Haiti were their own first responders. And so his view, there's a couple of things to talk about. We'll talk about the human nature thing, which is a bigger one. But specifically with regard to the role of the military in disaster relief, that's what he was specifically saying, that the relief has to trump security, right? Because if you can, depending on what your risk tolerance is for the security that you're trying to establish, that's going, if that has priority over the relief, then you're going to run into trouble. So there's always a couple of issues there. Disaster stuff is both rescue, that is when you're trying to find people under buildings or off of roofs or something like that, and then relief, right? And then stability and reconstruction. So how you weight those second two, as well as what you do with the relation with the people who are already their own first responders, right? So that's what I'm going to call the prosociality, that the capacities for self-aid of the Haitian people were already in action, and whether the security apparatus that came in later would organize and synthesize and catalyze that, which is Honore's position, now having learned it from what he did in Katrina, versus the other guys who had security trumping the relief. Oops. Okay. So this is not wishful thinking. The University of Delaware Disaster Research Center has done vast sociological analyses of disaster aftermaths. And they have found, and that's their term is prosocial behavior. That is trying, the sort of horizontal self-help first responder bit. And what they've also found, not on the slide, but it'll be interesting to work through it, is a sort of Hollywoodization of disasters, in which there's often, it's kind of an interesting moral lesson. There's often one or two people who strike out on their own, and what happens to them? The dinosaur eats them. So there's a kind of ambiguous relationship to the bonding cooperation element to it, because almost always the guy who strikes off on his own gets morally blamed and also eaten or drowned or something like that. But there's an analysis of Hollywood disaster movies that would be interesting to do too. But what they do find is that the vaunted fear of panic almost never arises. You can get panic in some situations. Fire in a crowded room, you can get panic. But most of the time, you don't get panic. The stairwells in 9/11, for instance, there was no panic. That's the acknowledged historical fact, right? People cooperated, they brought people down, people sprained their ankle or were in a wheelchair, they were carried down in teams, so on and so forth. There was no panic. There was no grabbing, get out of my way, stuff like that. Or the other one, also fairly recently but well known, is when a plane ditched in the Hudson, or what was it, the East River, the Hudson, whichever one it ditched in. There was no panic, right? What you actually need is for the flight attendants to scream at the people and get them out of a kind of frozen torpor, you don't need to calm people down out of a panic. You need to get them up out of their seats. Right? So anyway, this whole stuff that I've been talking about is the social science consensus, right, in disaster aftermaths. Right? It's not just some sort of wishful Rousseauian thing about people who are nice. Okay, so the question then, it seems that you could say, if you saw the aftermath of the downfall of the state, according to the Fox people, is that the danger is that we need to reestablish the state as soon as possible to keep people from preying upon each other violently. If they don't get what they want, food and water, we'll see a bunch of stuff. So that's one position. The other position is that the disasters actually reveal a prosociality foreclosed upon by atomizing practices supported by the state. And the third one is that, in fact, though, securitization can produce the violence that retrospectively justifies that. This is well known in police work. They've done quite a bit of comparative study for police work, especially in Europe with soccer hooligans. And they know that the arrival of the police in riot gear with the plastic shields and the batons increases the risk of the violence, which then justifies showing up with batons. It doesn't mean you should just walk into the hooligan bar and say, hi, let's talk, right? But it does mean that they've known that, they've established this. They've certainly established this in other types of handling of civil disobedience with kettling and a bunch of these kind of tactics. Is just, if we know anything in social science, it raises the risk of the violence that then can be used to justify. Now, as far as this one here, I would say that here the atomization, the state produces atomization. This goes back to, or can be hooked up with what Foucault says in Birth of Biopolitics. So he asks, what's the difference between classical liberalism and neoliberalism? It's themes of, mostly with the 20th century people. So, well, he says, for the classical liberals, there was a natural propensity to truck and barter, I think is Smith's phrase, right? And so government should stay out of the way, leave civil society to itself, and markets arise, right? There's a sort of barter mechanism that arises, and then the state can help that by providing cash to providing cash nexus. That genealogy of the market by Smith is challenged by David Graeber in his book Debt, by the way, in that parenthesis. What Foucault will say is that for the neoliberals, markets and competition is artificial and fragile and needs government intervention in order to produce that. So I always try to be as concrete and literal as I can. We do that every day in our classes when we keep people from cooperating, because we call that cheating, and then we award them individual grades. Right? So we are those agents who create the artificial competition of individual grades and prevent the prosociality of cooperation that would ordinarily emerge. So if I turn it around, then that would be the nature that gets pushed down upon by the state. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but I do like to have that as an example. It happens all the time. Now, the classical modern poli-sci stuff would also talk about that all the time, because the problem with cooperation in individual grading is when you get a group of kids, then you get free riders. You four are going to get the same grade, right? But you don't do any work, but you all get the grade. So that's a problem is we're going to come up with, again, in a little bit, the current anthropology. Question about how that notion of free riders and cheater detection, what role that had in the evolution of human intelligence. So that's a particular thing. Okay, so again, that's our notion here. Pretty much said that, I think. I'll just leave that up for a minute. I think it's correct. You're not supposed to read the screen that's on the PowerPoint, right? You put that up there and you comment on the screen, isn't that right? Okay. So I'm not going to read the screen. But I think that's what we've been saying. Okay. Further questions then. One of Kant's great lines, I think, and I think it's in Perpetual Peace, but I'm not sure, but one of his political things is that politics is the art of designing a society such that even a race of devils would agree to join it. Right? That is, if you assume rational egoism or psychopathy, can you create a society such that you can convince them it's in their interest to join it or not? Or can we use cooperation as the basis of organization with protection against free-riding rational egoists and or traumatized people? So that there would be where I'm heading in this, trying to link forms of political philosophy to presuppositions about human nature. So this comes out a little bit, I think, then one of the stuff I've been reading a lot is very interesting, much more attention now paid to child development in philosophical stuff, and especially what's called the embodied mind or embedded mind stuff. And so in development, the question is, do we have to internalize constraining norms on the little wild beasts that children are, or do we provide scaffolds in which their desires for prosociality and cooperation will come forth? So one of the guys who does a lot of work in this area, especially interesting because he works with primates, other primates, with chimps and bonobos as well, is a guy named Michael Tomasello. He's had a name that's gotten some recognition, Michael Tomasello. A book called Why We Cooperate. So it's lots of very interesting experiments he does. Okay, I'm going to skip a little faster here since we have a little time delay with the stuff, and I do know people are worried about that. This is a book I read in a course that I do called Evolution and Biology of Morality, which is not actually a moral philosophy course, it's more of a moral psychology course. How is it that people come to be emotionally invested in the social patterns that they find themselves in? Not how can we normatively evaluate the social patterns of society X or Y. But she has a very interesting move looking at evolutionary psychology and its use of financial metaphors, reproductive strategies, investment strategies, you know, the whole bit about female and male having different reproductive strategies. And she pulls out a lot of this stuff. She's in the Marshall Solin School of Anthropology from the University of Chicago. So this is one of the great lines in evolutionary psychology, the view of human nature as psychopathy, or all nature as psychopathy. That is what society is the construction of constraints that will keep people from maximizing their individual utility, which in this case is murdering if they want to. And so the only thing that keeps them back is he says, expedience. This particular line is repeated endlessly. So that's this question about whether, I think, well, it'll take a long time to get to that. We'll address it in a little bit. So that's the view of human nature. Because that's the scary thing in the second one, right? Where they're trying to warn, is it Julianne Moore who takes Jodie Foster's role in the second one? Right? And they're trying to say, well, you have to watch out for this guy because last time we had him in for an EKG, he almost killed the nurse. And his heart rate never got above 110. Right? So remember that one? Right? So this is the cold-blooded psychopath who kill or not kill depending on his own calculation as to whether it's in his interest or not. That is, what is the chance of me being caught? You know, there's this sort of probability. Okay, Eleanor Ostrom's a great, part of this a little disjointed, but I'm going to try to throw out some resources of people that I've been reading. She's a very interesting person. She unfortunately just passed away. about maybe a year ago, but she's the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for Economics. She actually was a political scientist at Indiana University. Her husband's an important figure too. And her great book is called Governing the Commons, and that is a reaction against Garrett Hardin's 1968 essay called The Tragedy of the Commons, which was sort of presented a false choice in order to preserve common pool resources, like a fishery or a forest or a grazing ground, something in which multiple exploiters have to hold in common. Right? So it's a sort of free rider problem, but overexploiting person. And Garrett Hardin says, well, there's only two choices. Either you privatize it, right, and create a market for property rights in this common pool resource, or you have the state who comes in from above. Right? So it was often used in privatization arguments throughout the 70s and 80s to argue you only have two choices, and since the free market's going to preserve individual freedom better, let's go for that. And she said, hold on a second, well, why don't we do a little bit of empirical research? And she found all sorts of examples of fisheries held in common, neither states or markets, that lasted for hundreds of years. Now, it does not mean there aren't norm enforcement practices, including, oh my God, the poor guy fell overboard and drowned. Like there are ways of handling overexploiters which don't have to be either states or markets. So she showed that. And then this later stuff is where I'm getting this idea that, that along with the idea that the police can produce the violent behavior that retrospectively justifies their securitization of the situation, she's able to show that if you set up public policies on the basis of assuming that people are rational egoists and need external rewards and punishments, you can destroy the prosocial behavior that would have been there and thereby create the necessity for added policies based on external rewards. So the example that is often used here is when the British went from a free volunteer blood donation system to actually paying people for donating blood, their contributions plummeted. Right? So there's something about that. I haven't really explained that properly, but this work in this collection by these behavioral economists is some very interesting stuff. So again, just throwing out some names. We've talked about this, I think. To come back to the Haiti example, and it's even more clear in Katrina. If you assume that you need security, so you securitize the disaster relief effort, right? You need to wait until you're able to have your security apparatus on state. So it played out the same in Haiti. It was probably a little more famous in the United States, but in Katrina, on the levees started breaking on Monday. The storm hit on a Sunday. Levees started breaking on a Monday. There was a spontaneous relief effort by the people of New Orleans and the people outside New Orleans. There were their own first responders through Tuesday night. At that point, the rumors of shooting at helicopters in Somalia and a whole bunch of stuff, being knee-deep. We could do a real psychoanalysis of why Neil Cavuto thought having a bunch of black guys on the street without police means that you're knee-deep in something. But in the name of the securitizing of the New Orleans relief effort, the civilian relief effort was stopped right, on Tuesday night, and the relief wasn't brought back into place until Friday afternoon. Right? So in those 3 days, you could create the conditions for right the competition and the violence, and there wasn't much, but there was some violence, and or looting. We'd have to analyze what looting means in a disaster situation. But which then retroactively justified why we needed to bring the tanks in, right? Because see all these broken windows. So there's that's the sort of disaster side of this bit where you justify retroactively your presupposition of what people are like. Okay, so I'm going to move a little more quickly. So the biological question then is, how does altruism or prosociality, altruism being a motivation for prosociality, how does that evolve? Why aren't we all free riders? Right? Why aren't we all psychopaths? You can answer that easily on a group selection level. Darwin himself proposed that group selection, if you have competition between groups, a group that had the appropriate balance of selfish and altruistic people would be able to outcompete a group that had only selfish people. So he used the example of war, which is something we're going to come back to. But in a war in which some of the warriors are willing to put themselves into dangerous situations and potentially sacrifice themselves, are going to beat a group for whom any rational analysis of increased risk over reward means run away, run away. So group selection is no problem with having that. If you don't accept group selection, then you have an issue. How is it that individual genes, traits, or organisms evolve even though they have a fitness cost? So, at the gene level, we have these three things. Kin selection is the idea that you share your genes with your kin, so that whatever the fitness cost to you is, if the help that you're giving to your kin times the degree of relatedness is greater than the fitness cost, then you can see that it would work. So the joke is, one guy says, I would sacrifice myself for 2 brothers or 8 cousins. So it's kind of happen. So you can get away from it that way, right? You can say there's actually a recompense. It's not altruism in any sort of moral sense, right? It's like an investment. It's going to be paid back, although the agents of this investment are the genes. Right? So that's a debate here about gene level selection. Mutualism is simply that if you and I collaborate and we bring down this woolly mammoth, then we both get to share in the woolly mammoth. That's easy. Direct and indirect reciprocity would be like, well, I don't know if I can catch a woolly mammoth, but I caught a squirrel today, right? You didn't catch a squirrel, but I'll give you half, because tomorrow you're going to help me out, right? Am I right, brother? Then indirect is when you observe this and you say, hey, that Protevi, he's a good guy. I'm going to introduce him to my sister. Indirect reciprocity is getting a reputation, and that's going to happen. Then we have these other forms of selection. We're going to come to social selection. I think we've already talked about this. If we were to incorporate this into a full-fledged moral philosophy class, bringing moral psychology in to bear with moral discussion, and then the relationship between intuitions and discussion, and whether you can change your intuitions through a prolonged process of rationally and by a process of normative reflection, reflective equilibrium, and that kind of thing. Is that possible to change over time? That would be some of the things we would have to bring to bear if we're going to expand this. Okay, Bohm is a very interesting guy, and I think I'm going to move to him quickly, then I'm going to move to the question of pre-state war, and then I think that'll be more than enough time. The Spinoza question, I think we can discuss in discussion. All right? So Bohm is a very interesting guy. He's an anthropologist who has studied forager societies, right? Nomadic forager societies. Used to be called hunter and gatherer societies, but now they're called forager societies. It's a very difficult question about how can you extrapolate from the findings of contemporary contemporary forager societies to pre-state forager societies. All anthropologists agree that prior to the state, foraging was the dominant social form. There were some settlements. If you had a particularly rich fishing ground, for instance, there's probably some horticulture going quite a ways back, but the scientific consensus in the anthropology realm is that foraging was the major social form throughout our evolutionary history as a human race. So he studies these guys today. The problem is that most foragers today live on not very exploitable ground. They've been squeezed out by states, so on and so forth. So it's difficult to be able to extrapolate from their social relations to what pre-state forager societies like. So it's a very difficult and complicated question. Lots of bitter debates about it. He's quite careful, and if you can accept what he's saying, he comes up with what he calls social selection, which are 3 forms of reinforcing egalitarianism. So forager societies are rigorously egalitarian. Meaning that I have to share my food with you, or else all of you guys are going to socially select against it. So what are the 3 forms of social selection? Number 1 is ridicule. It's a very powerful force. Right? So it's a gang of ridicule. To prevent that, foragers often self-deprecate. Oh, come on in. I mean, look, I'm such a terrible hunter. Look at this little measly thing. I'm really ashamed to give it. But damn, would you come and share my food? And of course, it's like this magnificent feast, right? So ridicule. The next is going to be exile. So you're such a great hunter. Go ahead and do it yourself. Right? Just go down, right? You see this reflected, obviously, with ostracism in ancient Athens and other forms of exile. And then killing. Basically, the idea, the way he describes it is, look, anybody can get mad and can get drunk, sexual jealousy, okay. And you kill somebody, you make amends. There's forms to make amends. So on and so forth, we'll let you go. Kill somebody else, or even get mad enough to kill somebody else, that's it. Something went wrong, we don't know what's wrong with you, sorry, but you're too much of a risk. Because we don't want you killing somebody in this other tribe and having us have a big schmear with the other tribe, right? So we're just going to... So it's not that forager society doesn't have violence, right? They've got a number of different forms of violence, right? But what they don't have is war defined as anonymous intergroup violence such that I'm legitimated in being a member of this group and killing any member of that group. That's the definition of war that the anthropologists give. Some of them give that, in order to distinguish what forager society violence from state war. Now it's quite complicated there. The reason I say it's outsmarting Nietzsche is that there's an analytic philosopher named J.J.C. Smart, who was a physicalist and philosopher of mind. He was also a notorious utilitarian, and so they would ask him questions like, oh, would you sacrifice this young child in order to have world peace? And he'd say, he's expected to have some sort of moral quandary. He'd say, well, of course I am. I'm a moral human being. Wouldn't you? That's an easy question. You should ask me a hard question. Right? So that became known as outsmarting. That is, you take the attempted reductio, accept it, and push it back. So he's outsmarting Nietzsche in the sense, the herd gangs up and kills the would-be aristocrats. Right? And it's outsmarting them because Bohm says, well, of course they did. That's the idea, right? They wanted to be the king, right? We don't want them to be the king, so we killed them. They wouldn't share the meat. There's no mystery here, right? You're not, now, the next term of the thing is that Nietzsche is not saying that the herd kills the aristocrats as a moral criticism, as if they could have done anything different. But a sort of easy understanding of Nietzsche is that, he's complaining that the herd kills the aristocrats. He's not. But if you thought that he was complaining about it, then Bohm is outsmarting him. He's saying, of course we do. All right, Machiavellian intelligence. That's the free rider problem. What drives human evolution of intelligence? Is it that we're a social animal and therefore we have to get good at detecting cheaters and free riders? Bohm and these next two people, Sarah Hurdy, a wonderful book, or Kim Sterelny, say no. It's not difficult to figure out cheaters in forager society. We're only talking about 100 people, right, in a band. Right? If you didn't share the meat, it's not a mystery. I don't need to increase my intelligence to figure out that you're a free rider. Right? What's difficult is cooperation. How can we find ways of doing philosophy of mind, or theory of mind, moral emotional mind reading and that kind of thing in order to build cooperation. That's the difficult challenge that probably drove human intelligence, not detecting. I'm going to skip through that. I'm going to put this on my website, a PDF version, so you can certainly ask me questions about some of the more technical stuff here. But I want to get to this final question. This is other stuff about debates within philosophy of mind about for and against evolutionary psychology. The question of modularity in particular. But this Nini is about epigenetics, really famous stuff about rats, and the question about whether you can, we know that rats, you can establish patterns of inheritance on the behavioral level. Rats who lick their pups, rat mothers who lick their pups, will give birth to pups who will lick their pups in turn, higher than average, and same thing with the other one. He postulates a biochemical mechanism for that. It's methylation. Methylation is a fatty deposit outside of the DNA, which helps increase the rate of gene expression. And the gene that's expressed is the protein that's produced in this gene expression is called oxytocin. And oxytocin is a very interesting mammalian hormone that postulated to be involved in bonding, because what it does is it creates a link between dopamine-mediated pleasure and particular sensory profiles of the person to whom the pleasure is being produced. That's what oxytocin does. It links pleasure to a person. And so it's postulated to be a bonding mechanism. And this is describing the way in which the gene expression could be a mechanism for increasing the oxytocin production, and hence the mechanism that can explain the bonding behavior that's passed out. But I want to get to this. All right, question, please take it. So we have this prosociality idea, right? How was it produced? We said that on group selection. If you said war was the selection pressure between groups, then you can have this sort of ironic, kind of Alanis Morissette notion of ironic, this paradoxical or counterintuitive notion that it was war that made us prosocial, right? Because in Darwin's hypothesis, right, or scenario, the group that's at war with another group, if you have soldiers willing to sacrifice themselves, you would tend to win it. So then the question is, Storelny and Hurdy don't necessarily say that. They would say there's independent selection pressures within the group for cooperation and prosociality, right, rather than intergroup war relations that drive prosociality. So there's three elements here. I'm going to end with this slide. In order to discuss this, right, the pro side tends to say, well, look, we're related to chimpanzees. Chimpanzees have lots of intergroup violence. The response to that is twofold response. Number one, yes, but we're also related, or at least our closest common ancestor was the common ancestor between us, chimpanzees, and bonobos. Bonobos are famously the hippies of the animal kingdom, right? They solve their conflicts not by fighting, but by whoopee. And so that's number one. But the other one is that what exactly is chimpanzee intergroup violence? And it turns out it's raiding, right, rather than war. And that's what we get to down here in this analysis. What are the social structures of nomadic foragers support war? But this one is there physical evidence of extensive pre-state war? And there's a couple of wonderful analyses of claims that trying to show that Steven Pinker, for instance, in his latest book, Better Angels, cherry-picked the archaeological sites. There's like 250 pre-state archaeological sites, and he picked the 37 that had crushed skulls, right? So not only did he cherry-pick that, and then there's lots of others. So it's technical archaeological debates about how you date these things, and I'm not competent, but it's fascinating reads if you want to look at that. But this last one here is then, did the social structure of nomadic forager bands support extensive war? So the question is, are our social structures in the forager societies like that of chimpanzee bands who do ambushes? 6 or 7 chimps will patrol a border, turn the border into basically a no man's land or no chimp's land, and kill any wandering chimps that find of the neighboring tribe. Is that the way social structures are like in forager society? And Raymond C. Kelly will say no. This guy here. The forager society does not support the logic of social substitution. He's got a lot of technical stuff. I'm not going to go into it, right? But if I can send you the link. But Raymond C. Kelly this is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and it's very interesting, very technical stuff. But I'm going to end with my last clip. If we go back, if we go back to the stuff about forager societies and ways to prevent intergroup war, one of the ways to prevent intergroup war is to keep revenge as a personal matter. So, Inigo Montoya is a great anti-war figure. Because what does he say?
Hello. My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die.
So why is that anti-war? Right? It's not, my group is going to go sack your castle and kill everybody that's ever been associated with you, six-figure man. Right? No, I'm going to kill you. Right? Well, that's an anti-war structure. That's a social selection way in which, what's his name, Kelly talks about ways of forager societies avoiding war. And one of them is personal ones. The last one is, very interestingly, a lot of the, I gave that little example of execution, right? We have a mad dog and we're going to have to keep you from killing again. If you had killed, I don't know who's going to be my mad dog here. If you had killed somebody in that band, right? In order to prevent a war or extended family feud between this band and that band, what are we going to do in this band? We're going to kill you and present your body to them and saying, see, you don't need to do, we've already taken care of this thing. This is our peace offering. So it's kind of along that same line. If you keep it personal, you avoid the group structure. Okay, let's call it that.